Welcome to Hard Fork, recorded live in the eye of the hyper-Bitcoinization hurricane, coming at you from the frontier of the fourth turning and counting down the final hours of the fiat economy. Stay tuned as we debate the issues that matter, prepare for what's coming next, and make sense of it all. My name is Julian Farah, and I'm here with my brother, co-founder, and co-host, Thomas. And today we are going to discuss the sovereign individual. This was a 1997 book by James Dale Davidson and Lord William Rees-Mogg, and it explores how the advent of information technology is radically transforming society, diminishing the power of nation states, and reshaping economic and political structures across the world. It makes a lot of interesting predictions about the society that was to come, that we now live in today, and a lot of interesting predictions related to the world of Bitcoin too. We're going to break it all down in just a moment. Thomas, you ready?
Yeah, I'm ready. Let's go.
All right, let's do it. Okay, let's chat about the sovereign individual. So this is a book familiar to many people, many Bitcoiners, not just Bitcoiners, people who are interested in tech, in big macro, mega political trends, schizo posters, memers, preppers, doomers, techno-optimists. It covers a lot of ground. So it's a massive book. I think Tom, is 500 plus pages. We're not going to break the whole thing down now, but it makes a bunch of interesting predictions. And particularly for people who might be wanting to learn about it before reading it, that I think is perhaps the most important thing to know. And maybe the most interesting thing about it is to go back and read an immensely ambitious book written 30 years ago that makes specific and quantifiable predictions on a massive scale about what's to come in the future. Many of them played out. So before we dive into it, do you have any initial thoughts on the sovereign individual and what you want to dig into?
Yeah, look, I mean, I think it was the most prescient book certainly the most relevant book for our times, basically. In fact, I go as far as to say you can't understand the world we live in today if you haven't read that book, because there's a lot of confusion that comes with the information age. The world dramatically changes as a result of some of the big themes that's addressed in this book, like the change in the relative importance of power. And there are just so many big themes that come out of that book that you won't understand. There are all these sort of seemingly different events that are happening around the world that seem like they have no connection whatsoever, but actually are all thematically linked. And if you haven't read the book, or you don't understand these big core ideas, you're just left confused. So I think it's the perfect thing to understand and look into, and it is immensely helpful for people trying to understand Bitcoin as well, why it's having this big effect on society. I mean, the sovereign individual, written in 1997, actually, what was it, 95 even, I think, but
97 it was published.
97.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah. It predicted Bitcoin amongst, as well as the COVID pandemic, as well as just about every major shift we've seen over the last few years. So I think, yeah, let's get into it and kind of break down some of the core ideas. And some of the really interesting like the one-liners and things that just blow your mind.
Yeah. So let's jump into, well, before we jump into some of the main ideas, let's talk about the context. I think the context of when the book was written is a really important thing to understand. As I mentioned, published in 1997. What's happening in 1997? It's the rise of the internet, right? And this is really the subtext of the book itself, is this rise of what was correctly seen as the coming information age, and the impact that was going to have on the world in many different ways. Now, what is, I guess, the core thesis then of the sovereign individual? Really, well, one of them, I think, is this idea that with the rise of information technology, that what we would see, or what the authors predicted we would see, is a change in what they called the returns to violence. And what they meant by that was basically the nation state as it existed then and still exists today has this monopoly on violence. It is the only legitimate under the law body that can use violence to, well, control populations, enforce laws, maintain law and order, collect taxes, and basically run the societies that we live in. But with the rise of the information age, what was predicted was that these returns to violence, in other words, what the kind of yield that you would get as an actor to be able to deploy violence, would change. So at that time, the returns to violence are enormous. If you can muster, if you control an army and police forces and so on, you basically control your entire subject population. But with the rise of the information age, certain things would change. What are some of those things? Well, so basically, what would happen, this is the prediction, is that nation states would be able to basically acquire resources less efficiently. It'd be harder to do that, right? If you can, obviously a crude analogy here is, let's say everybody's wealth is stored in gold coins, relatively easy to track that down, figure out who has what, who owes what. Collection of taxes is much more straightforward compared to digital money, or so that's one way. So anyway, so there's this core idea of like how are nations controlled and run? Well, it's through violence, and as everything digitizes, that just changes the kind of calculus there. Let's talk a little bit more about just some of the core theses and of the book, and then maybe we can kind of riff a little bit on how we think that either has or hasn't played out. But again, broadly here, so what are the authors saying? That basically there have been, in their eyes, three main phases through which human societies have gone or developed collectively. And these were first hunter-gathering, second agricultural age from 10,000 years ago through to 250, 300 years ago. Then we have the industrial era, which gave rise to these nation states. And now this kind of post-industrial era, information age, is what they were. And I think we still are on the cusp of. And so, whereas through the industrial era, people are organized in, communities and physical nations controlled by particular states. With the information age, one of the, I guess the predictions of the book was we would see the rise of these more of information societies. And so we would see the rise of people who are by way of being connected to the internet, would almost transition from not only identifying with their nations to identifying with communities that they're forming online, but actually really participating in them more in like an economic sense. And in particular, those of us who I think the book refers to as cognitive elite, basically, would be able to leverage information technology, join these information societies, and eventually be actually liberated physically from the nation state paradigm itself. And so that maybe is like a first jumping off point where we could talk about Bitcoin, because one of the, and again, this is predicted in the book, but it's, so we have the rise of this cognitive elite connected to the internet, forming information societies. They begin to identify with and participate in these information societies at the expense of maybe their nations of origin. But how do they do that? As in, one of the ways that the only way to do that is kind of exiting from the status quo system in a monetary sense, in a financial sense, right? And that's where this kind of prediction of digital currencies came in. And it's remarkable to read. I'll just read a couple of quotes here. Talking about digital, obviously this is pre-Bitcoin, but the authors said a couple of things. One, that there would be a rise of digital money, or cyber money, which would be all but impossible to counterfeit, that the verifiability of digital receipts will rule out the kind of classic expropriation of wealth through inflation. So already they were seeing a kind of end to this maybe long-term debt cycle of monetary debasement, and that there would be perhaps an avenue of exiting from this and transitioning to a cyber money, which was basically disconnected from the money printer. So prescient, to say the least.
Yeah, and I think one of the interesting things is when you talk about whether like the information age is here or it's coming, or the way this always tends to work is that the future is already here. It's just not evenly distributed. We have some people living in this information age right now, and then we have in some parts of the world they're not even in the industrial age. They're still living off the agricultural land, right? So that what we're seeing is some people are embracing this technology, embracing this freedom, and really utilizing the potential to escape. Well, in this case, when you're talking about money, it's where we're talking about basically escaping debasement, escaping inflation, which what we're really talking about is we're talking about a very legal but very real way to escape taxation. Actually,
yeah,
that's the
fundamental. And they mention that specifically. They call out this basically this idea of avoiding predatory taxation, right?
Yeah.
And one of the and again, I can't do justice, but it's it's explored in depth, this idea that so even prior to the money stuff, there's this kind of broad prediction that there'll be this downsizing of nation states who are unable to either expropriate wealth from their subjects or just marshal resources as efficiently and effectively. It's harder to collect taxes, it's harder to enforce laws, and so on. Now, a subsequent prediction that's made is, well, the nation states aren't going to go quietly, right? So as resource collection and allocation becomes harder, they're going to get more desperate. What are they going to do? Well, they are going to ratchet up enforcement actions, right? And so maybe it's interesting to pause here and just reflect on, like, do we see that happening? Because I think the answer clearly is yes. Like obviously we see, okay, we can talk about the US government, but it's true for governments around the world. The balance sheets are wrecked, completely wrecked. Massive debts everywhere, massive yearly deficits. And they are in a position of desperation. And we see tens of thousands of new IRS agents being called upon, like petty, almost like prosecution of individuals for like small amounts of, for tax collection and all this stuff. I think the desperation is clearly rising.
Well, I think we're seeing it It's a mix, and it depends on where you are. I mean, you look at China; they've done their absolute best to lock people into that system. I mean, the extent to which you there was an old theory about you could sort of measure the level of corruption in a society by basically how quickly did they adopt Uber, right? It's like, are people free to hop in somebody else's car and pay them for that trip, or what kind of a stronghold does the taxi system have? And you saw that very dramatically over the last 10 years. Similarly, you have we have this same level of freedom when it comes to Bitcoin adoption. Certain parts of the world, it's relatively free to do it, and then other parts of the world, they're kind of clamping down, and they don't really know, like, Balaji likes to say they're basically they're trying to close the doors, essentially. And I think that is happening to some extent, although what is probably undersold is just how difficult it is to get consensus in the government, because there are all these different the trouble, like, the thing about it is that we are in a democratic system where all these people have really competing incentives. So we have it's very difficult to get a consensus to do things like stop people escaping the system with Bitcoin, because half of the people in government, they want to escape the system with Bitcoin. You've got,
Yeah.
and I think that's going to be the story going forward, where you see just more and more politicians both advocating for Bitcoin at the same time as you see more trying to shut the door as well.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
part of the reason has got to be that I don't think this is like some of this is sort of latent understanding, but also some of this, like, they don't even know it themselves. The people that are governing us, right? They don't even understand these issues. They don't understand, like, half the people in government have no even concept of the limits to government, right? They literally don't see a problem with money printing because they don't understand. How many people, like, there are literally examples of politicians talking about how, the government just invents currency, so it doesn't matter how they spend it, right? Like, they can't be Machiavellian in a way to stop this digital age because they don't understand it themselves. Some do, though, but that's where it gets interesting.
Yeah. Yeah. I guess back to the book. Maybe we should touch on, I guess, maybe the last, or maybe main idea is the idea of the sovereign individual themselves, right? Like, take the title of the book, right?
Yeah.
So what is a sovereign individual, and why is it such a core part of the book, and what it's about? Well, really, it's the kind of, if you follow this train of logic to its conclusion, right? So we have the rise of the information age, resulting in the diminishing of the power of nation states. And in particular, you have individuals who can leverage information technology to I suppose, make themselves sovereign, right? But how and why? Well, one would be they get wealthy. That's kind of a first precondition. You're going to have some individuals who are very wealthy, but I guess that wealth then starts to tip the scales a little bit with respect to the nation states that they are a part of. And this is I guess the other core part of the book. It's the idea that you're going to have individuals who are connected to information societies, who maybe have the ability to move between them physically, who have a ton of wealth and and as the public ownership and control of resources diminishes, that vacuum is filled by private control and
Yeah.
influence over, right? And so let's talk about, let's go from the book to real life again. I think the example par excellence is Elon, right? We have to talk about Elon Musk. If there's any one person today that I think does embody this idea of the sovereign individual and is a living instantiation of it today, it's Elon, right?
Yeah.
This is, you can tie the actions of his, you can draw a direct link between specific quotes in this book about private control over formerly public resources, and such a great example. I mean, well, there are several in Elon's case, but let's just look at Twitter. Twitter a year ago was the public square of public discourse. It still is, but a year ago it was publicly owned, and I mean owned by the government.
Yeah.
And that is clear now. We have the proof of that. It was owned, operated, and controlled behind the scenes by the government. But one individual,
One man,
one private individual in this age was able to marshal enough resources to take control over this. And like, this is unthinkable. When we were growing up, 15 years ago, 20 years ago, like, this is absolutely unthinkable in the age of, I guess, newspapers and like network television news channels or whatever. The idea that one person would be able to fundamentally shift how public discourse happens was crazy. Would have been, but it's happened.
It's happened. I mean, when I mean, we can talk about Twitter and X. I think that's a good one. But I mean, my favorite one is thinking about how, like, the government asked them to turn off Starlink over in the Ukraine war to remove internet access, and Elon's like, no.
One man with direct material influence on the conduct of a war between ostensibly two nation states.
But it's not just, I mean, the thing is, I would say, I mean, yes, Elon is the ultimate example, but realistically, what we're seeing recently over the last several years is you have people take ownership of their wealth through Bitcoin. You have people homeschooling now. I mean, imagine taking the education system out of the government's hands. And then that is only going to accelerate with AI. Now that you've got AI that can really facilitate this education, it makes it so much easier. And I think the big thing about it is, for me, when I'm thinking about whether I want to homeschool my kids, I know I have no doubt in my mind that would be better for the kids. The question is that going to be better for me? Because it's just a big responsibility and a great challenge. But when you can have these education tools that are just getting, like, literally getting 50% better every year, like, it makes it so laughable to do anything else. I mean, you just think about the whole concept of traditional schooling, apart from the fact that it's clearly like, basically a prison for the kids. But you got 30 kids in a class, and they all have completely different skill levels and completely different abilities to learn, and they're all expected to. One teacher's got to teach them at the same. That literally works for nobody, right? The smart kids are bored out of their mind, and the dumb kids don't get it, and it just the whole system sucks. And it's just like, well, there's been no alternative.
I think we're not just talking about sovereign individualism, right? It's sovereign families, sovereign neighborhoods, sovereign communities. I think, my mental model for how all this works is, I think that, so take it back to the book, this idea of the receding powers of the nation state, I think, is broadly speaking true. And I think that is going to be filled by more responsibility taken by, more power devolved to other institutions, individual, family, community, obviously not in a linear fashion, not all at once. And as we know, it's talked about, the empire will strike back. But as you said before, this future is already kind of here, right? Like, we already see this today in the United States. There are like areas of this country that are ostensibly lawless. Like, for all intents and purposes, the state is already gone from parts of this country, and alternate institutions are stepping in, whether it's private security, people living in gated communities. Like, the more you look around, the more you actually, I think, you do start to see kind of cracks in the system.
Where one of the things that I find, there's a lot of exciting ideas in that book, and there's a few that really strike me is the discussion on risk averse society, like how people in general are risk averse, but how all the returns come to people that are willing to essentially take those risks, as long, like, basically the grand challenge being taking ideas to their logical conclusion. And that's something that book just does so persistently throughout everything.
Yeah.
It just thinks from first principles from the very beginning, and just attacks and takes things to its logical conclusion. And
I think on that, that's one of the things I would say reading The Sovereign Individual made me a much more confident Bitcoin maximalist. You know, and in particular, it was connecting Bitcoin and the idea of Bitcoin, not just to, you know, the code or the community or whatever, but connecting it to this kind of grand historical change that we're undergoing. Right. And specifically to the point about what do you do in the face of this change or this type of change? Well, what you don't do is you don't diversify, right? Like, you don't, you know, oh, I'm going to spread my, you know, I'm now confident that a paradigm shifting change is happening, and there maybe I have access to this tool that might be actually tailored to this paradigmatic change and might help prepare me for it, and maybe even might help me benefit from it. What am I going to do? Spread my bets around? Like, no, this is the thing. Bitcoin is the thing.
And the way it talks, I mean, the thing that I find just so amazing is the way it talks about how people will fight and scratch and claw for the old system, even as it evaporates underneath their feet. But they're naturally going to be scared about a technological revolution, and they're going to fight for the old system, and they're going to hate it. And the people that are incapable of thinking through first principles, I mean, I think that way. I see that way when I think about the gold bugs. I really do, because I can see why it would be so terrifying to have this new idea that's replacing something that's like, like gold has been around forever, and it's like, now you're telling me this, like, technology has come along and you've got something better than gold when gold's been there for 5,000 years. And it's like, yes. And that's such a bold, audacious claim to make, to be like, I know you've got the 5,000 year history, but we've got the technology that makes it better. And these people, unfortunately for them, they're basically like, you know, like horse maximalists, you know, for travel, or they're like candlestick.
Okay, so let's go through the four ages, right? It's like, you could be at the turn of the hunter-gatherer to agricultural nation-state age. You could be a spear maximalist, right? Or you could see the writing on the wall and, like, buy a plot of land and build a grain silo on it. You know, crude example here. And in industrial age, you can be a, like, scythe, you know, hoe tilling the field maxi, which many people were, like Luddites. Or you can go and invest in tractors, you know?
Right.
And then in the information age, you can be a gold bug, you can be a nation state maxi, or you can buy Bitcoin, you know? Like, what are you going to do?
And I would say I see a lot of similarities between this and also like relative embracing of AI versus the people that want to, basically shun the idea. Like it's basically what we're talking about is cope, essentially.
Yeah.
It's cope for when you have this new technology that changes the way things, and humans have to adapt to these big macro technology changes. It's not that the technology doesn't really adapt to humans. It doesn't work that way. These big thematic things happen, and it's like that. There's nothing stopping this train. You have to figure out a way to make it work for you, because this just praying that it's going to be the way it was when you were a kid. It's just frankly, it's the way to, stay poor, basically.
Yeah. Well, that's maybe a good segue into kind of wrapping up with some closing thoughts, and particularly and bringing it back to the book, right? And I think it's an opportunity to say, okay, so why read a book like this? Like, why does it matter? Even a 30-year-old book like this. And the first thing is, okay, to the book being 30 years old, well, it's because it's about a grand historical change that is happening over the course of decades, right?
Hundreds of years.
But it's part of a cycle of changes that happen over hundreds of years. And so I think this is the first reason to read a book like this. It's to recognize that these cycles do happen. If the only thing you do is consume news every day, you can become like the kind of NPC type person who only thinks on the cycle of what's in the headlines every day. But history happens much, much slower in a sense, but just much more spread out, like mega politics, mega history. So that's reason number one. Reason number two would be, okay, now that we know that these changes happen, it's diagnosing the age that we are actually in today, right? It dispels maybe some confusion and some misunderstanding about what the nature of these changes that people I think everybody has a gut feel for these kind of paradigm shifting tectonic plate movements. And it's a diagnosis of that, and I think a sound one. But then the third reason is because you got to prepare for it. You got to deal with that. And you can either be a victim of it, or you can ride the tide of it, or you can actually set yourself up to manage it, benefit from it, and propel yourself into what's coming next. And that's broadly what I think the book does. Specifically, it's an excellent orange pilling tool in helping people to realize that this tool that we have in front of us in the form of Bitcoin might just be that thing that helps kind of set yourself up to go along with this change. So anyway, those I guess would be my three reasons about why it's worth reading The Sovereign Individual.
Yeah, look, I mean, I completely agree. I think it just providing the context of looking at the major shifts of the world, like, as you said, with the agricultural aspect and the way that changed the returns to power, because then there was these like centralized honeypots that people could attack, or the way the printing press changed the way information was dispersed and how that created a dynamic change in power. Or the other thing that just strikes me is how it doesn't matter whether, like, it just doesn't matter what you feel about it. Like, you can like it or not like it, but it's happening. There are certain things that are great about it, about this new world, and there are certain things that, like, it was better 20 years ago.
Yeah.
But there's no point in trying to wish it was different, right? Yeah. Like, this train is.
You can't bury your head in the sand. You can't bury your head in the sand. You can't wish it were otherwise. You can't vote your way out of it.
Now, what's interesting is that we live in a world where a lot of people think they can bury their head in the sand. And I say that specifically because the way the power structures we live in today are, old people run the world by and large. And they feel it's not completely irrational. They don't care because they're going to die soon. And so that's the flip side of that, where you just don't like it affects two levels. It affects their understanding of it. You know, older people obviously struggle with tech inherently, but also they just don't have any kind of incentive to figure it out, basically.
No.
Like, how are you going to talk to Charlie Munger and tell him about Bitcoin when he's 100 years old, and this fiat world has been tremendously beneficial to him.
Yeah.
And
if the stock market tanks and boomer portfolios take a massive drawdown, then they're going to do what they have done in the recent past again and print $10 trillion just to pump them back up. Right? Keep stealing from the future for the people desperately holding on to the present.
I was talking to an incredibly successful businessman over the weekend that's like 85 years old. And he approached me and he wanted to talk about Bitcoin. And the thing that he kept going back to was, yeah, but I can't touch it. I can't touch it. Now, the thing about it is that it doesn't make sense, because obviously we know how, like, the vast majority of the world's wealth is in the digital, like, this is exploding, right? If you look at the last 20 years, it's all been captured by technology company. You can't touch Facebook, you can't touch TikTok, and you can't touch Bitcoin. You can't touch the internet. But, you know, when you're old, you just don't have I just don't have the incentive to learn or do anything different. But when you're talking to young people, you have to figure it out because you're going to be around a long time. So it's going to affect you.
Well, we do. And people our age do. People younger than Charlie Munger, who actually do have a stake in the future, do. And so why don't we leave it at that? If you feel like you do have a stake in the future, go and buy some Bitcoin and go and grab a copy of The Sovereign Individual, read it, study it, enjoy it, and we will see you next time on Hard Fork.
Yeah, good job.